Let me take you back to the night that cracked everything wide open. A Thursday in late October, with gray skies, greasy air, and the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. It was my birthday, my 42nd, and I already knew I'd regret showing up the second I pulled into Mom's driveway. You know that dread you feel when you have to sit through another round of performative family warmth, where every question has teeth and every compliment feels like a backhand. That was tonight. I parked beside my cousin Nate's shiny leased SUV and stepped out into a puddle deep enough to baptize me in disappointment. My mom's house hadn't changed in 20 years, and neither had the people inside it. There was the smell of overcooked brisket mixed with lemon pledge, and the faint echo of Fox News humming low on the living room TV. The place where I spent my childhood trying not to be noticed had now become the stage for yet another episode of family theater, the annual birthday dinner of Eli the Disappointment. I walked in holding a bottle of Cabernet no one would appreciate and a cheesecake from that little French place downtown, which I knew Aunt Carla loved but wouldn't dare admit. I barely had the door shut before I heard his voice, deep, loud, and always just a bit too proud. Uncle Roy, beer already in hand, laughed the moment he saw me like he'd been waiting all week just to swing the first punch. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he boomed, the kind of voice that makes drywall tremble. "You still doing that little computer thing, Eli?" He said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, his smirk aimed straight at me like a hunting rifle. I looked over at him, 60-something, barrel-chested, beer gut hanging proudly like a veteran's medal, still wearing his work boots indoors. The man had been laying bricks and swinging hammers longer than I'd been alive, and he wore that as a badge of honor. In Roy's world, if you didn't come home sweaty and sore, you weren't a man. And if your job involved sitting, screens, or silence, it didn't matter how much money you made, you were still a joke. I nodded and smiled, just like I always did. That's how it went every time. Eli the soft one, Eli the nerd, Eli the guy who couldn't keep his marriage, Eli the guy with no kids and too many opinions. I said something polite, something meaningless, and moved on to greet the others. Nate shook my hand a little too firmly, the way guys do when they need to prove something. He asked about work stuff with glazed eyes, already bored by the time I opened my mouth. His wife, Stacy, pretended not to notice me. She hadn't since the time I corrected her on whether turmeric was a root or a spice. And Mom, bless her, pulled me into a hug like I was 12 again, whispered, "You look tired," and then called me her late bloomer in front of everyone. Dinner was already on the table, brisket, mashed potatoes, green beans with too much butter, and Roy's homemade cornbread that tasted like drywall soaked in regret. We sat down in our usual seats, like an annual reenactment of a scene nobody actually wanted to relive. For the first 20 minutes, I barely spoke. I just listened. Roy talked about real work like he was still laying railroad in the Wild West. Nate talked about sales targets and how many miles his Peloton said he rode last week. Every sentence had one goal, to make me feel like less. And then, just as dessert was about to be brought out, Roy leaned back in his chair, stretched his arms wide, and let out a booming chuckle. He looked right at me, eyes twinkling with that mean old sparkle he's carried since Reagan was president. "Only the real breadwinners get dessert," he said. And the whole table laughed. It wasn't just a joke. It was a performance, and I was the punchline. The loser in jeans who no one believed was doing anything of value. The one who never bragged, never brought dates, never explained how his company had just been acquired for 8 figures. I'd kept it quiet for a reason, and now, in that moment, I almost regretted that choice. Except for one person. Aunt Carla didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She just looked at me across the table, her fork hovering over her plate, and something behind her eyes shifted. I caught her glance, and she gave me a small, tight nod. Nothing grand. Nothing loud. But it said everything. I'd sent her the link to the CBS interview earlier that week. She hadn't replied. Now I knew why. See, the thing about family is, they'll bury you in the same box they built for you at 16. They don't care how much you grow, or what mountains you move, or how many people now look to you for guidance. If they saw you as the kid who couldn't throw a football, or the guy who cried at his own wedding, then that's who you'll always be. Until you force them to see something else. And Aunt Carla? She was about to change the whole damn picture. I didn't say anything. Not yet. Because when the knives are out, silence is your sharpest weapon. And dessert hadn't even been served yet. You could hear the clink of silverware on ceramic plates as the laughter from Roy's little jab hung in the air like a fog that wouldn't clear. It wasn't just a joke. It was a declaration, a gauntlet thrown down, a reminder to every person at that table who the alpha was. I sat there, smiling just enough to keep the peace, but inside, something shifted like a fault line deciding it's time to move. The word breadwinner bounced around my skull with the sharpness of a paper cut you don't notice until the blood starts to show. Everyone else laughed because that's what you do when Roy speaks like that. You laugh, or you become the target. Nate chuckled while sipping his cheap wine like it was a toast to mediocrity, and even my mother offered a half-hearted "Oh, Roy," with that tired smile she wore when trying to pretend things weren't what they clearly were. And for a moment I almost said nothing, almost let it pass like every other jab, every other year, every other dinner, but then I saw Carla reach for the remote. It was a tiny, almost invisible gesture. Her hand moved slowly, like she wasn't sure if she should go through with it, like she was weighing 30 years of family silence against the weight of one righteous moment. She didn't look at anyone, just pressed the power button and turned the volume up slightly. The old TV buzzed to life, sound low but present, and I recognized the voice before I saw the screen. It was mine. A tight, quiet tension took over the room the moment my name came out of the television. Not from my mouth, but from the host's, David Elridge, anchor of the national CBS Business Spotlight. He said it clearly, without hesitation, like it belonged next to words like visionary and startup genius. My face appeared a second later, clean-shaven, calm, wearing that navy blazer I'd bought just for the interview and hadn't told a soul about. The cheerin' under my name read Eli Kramer, CEO, CloudPath Systems, acquired for $24 million. $24 million. The words didn't echo out loud, but you could feel them hitting the table like bricks. Forks stopped moving. Nate blinked like someone had just pulled a fire alarm in his brain. My mother stared at the screen with a soft gasp, and even she didn't try to hide it. Stacy lowered her wine glass, so slowly it looked like it weighed 10 pounds. But Roy, he didn't move. He kept chewing his brisket like it was cardboard, eyes fixed on the screen, jaw grinding like a machine forced to keep running after it already knows the gears are shot. His laughter was gone. His smirk was gone. And for the first time in my life, I saw something close to confusion crack his hard shell of certainty. I hadn't told them about the acquisition. I hadn't said a damn word about the cameras, or the meeting with CBS, or the night my life had changed in a quiet conference room in Palo Alto. I'd built CloudPath out of the rubble of a failed marriage, sleepless nights, and a dozen bank accounts that dipped into red more times than I'd care to admit. While they'd written me off as the computer guy, I was building something real, something I bled for, something that now belonged to a global tech firm with offices in 5 countries. The TV played a short clip from the interview, just me talking about our early challenges, the sleepless nights, how we pivoted from data infrastructure to AI-enabled workflow tools, and the moment we finally found a buyer who understood our vision. And when David Elridge asked me what it felt like to close a deal that big, I had smiled and said, honestly, it still doesn't feel real. But watching it play out in that cramped dining room, it did feel real. It felt like justice. And then the silence broke. Nate was the first to speak, probably because silence made him itch. Wait, you didn't tell us about this, he said, his voice a notch too high to hide the panic. I shrugged and said, didn't think anyone would be interested in what I do. I watched the flicker of shame cross his face like a passing cloud. He wasn't mad that I didn't tell them, he was mad that I could do something like this, that I had the audacity to succeed outside their expectations. Carla muted the TV and turned toward Roy. I figured it was time everyone knew, she said. Her tone was calm, like someone letting the air out of a long overinflated balloon. Roy didn't answer. He wiped his mouth with a napkin he hadn't used all meal, then reached for his beer like he was trying to find something solid to hold onto. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't smile. He just sat there, staring at the TV screen like he could somehow rewind it with sheer willpower. That's when Mom finally spoke, her voice cracking a little, maybe with pride, maybe with something else. Eli, why didn't you tell us? I looked at her and said, because every time I tried to share something, it got laughed off, or ignored, or turned into a story about someone else's mortgage rate or a knee surgery. And that's the truth of it, isn't it? You can love your family, but still dread them. You can grow up trying to earn their approval, only to realize they were never looking for someone to admire, they were looking for someone to keep beneath them. So I let the moment breathe. I didn't gloat. I didn't say anything clever. I just picked up my glass of water, took a sip, and waited for the next move. Because the thing about battles like this, winning doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like silence. And that silence, at least for now, was mine. There's something deeply satisfying about knowing something no one else in the room does, something that hums under your skin like a second heartbeat, a private little fire that keeps you warm while everyone around you thinks you're cold. That's exactly what I felt in the days leading up to the dinner, holding this enormous, burning truth in my hands like it was a glowing coal I couldn't let go of yet. I hadn't told them because I didn't need to, and honestly, I didn't trust them with it. Not yet. The CBS interview came out of nowhere. One Monday afternoon, I was in the middle of answering 100 emails, eating half a protein bar for lunch, and trying to juggle a call with lawyers from Singapore when a producer from the network reached out. She said they were doing a feature on small startup founders who'd built their companies from scratch and sold them for substantial returns, quiet success stories. Not the loud, VC-hungry types, but the ones who lived in apartments too small for their ambition and stayed up nights writing code that would one day turn into gold. She said I fit the bill. I said I didn't have the time. Then she said the segment would air on national television, in prime time, just before their evening news. Suddenly, I found the time. They sent a small crew to my co-working space downtown, nothing fancy, just 2 camera guys, a sound tech, and a guy named Marcus who asked good questions and didn't pretend to know what a containerized workflow infrastructure meant. I appreciated that. We filmed for nearly 2 hours, though only 3 minutes would make it to air. But in those 2 hours, something happened that I didn't expect, something I didn't even know I needed. I started to hear myself. I started talking about the early days, back when it was just me and a broken laptop on my coffee table, trying to write code while my ex-wife screamed at me from the bedroom about our bills and my hobby. I remembered the feeling of having $37 in my checking account and having to decide between gas and groceries. I remembered pitching to a room full of men in Patagonia vests who barely looked up from their phones, and then driving home in silence wondering if I was insane. I talked about the first real client we landed, the one who paid us $5,000 and made me feel like I was suddenly Rockefeller. And then the crash came, the server failure, the lost data, the lawsuit threat, the moment I almost gave it all up. I didn't hold anything back, not because I wanted pity or applause, but because for the first time in years, someone was actually asking not to mock, not to dismiss, but to understand. And it dawned on me that no one in my family had ever really done that. Not once. They'd heard I was working on something, and they'd nod politely before switching the conversation back to Roy's new grill or Nate's fantasy football stats. So when the interview wrapped and the producer said it would air the following Thursday, yes, that Thursday, I felt a flicker of something almost dangerous. I told them to go ahead and run it. I knew exactly what day it would land. I knew exactly where I'd be. And I knew exactly what it would do. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mom. Not Nate. Not even Carla, at least not right away. But the morning of my birthday, I texted her a link to the preview clip. No context. No explanation. Just the link and a simple message that said, "You might want to watch tonight." She didn't reply. Not until that night, when her hand reached for the remote. And I guess that's the part that stuck with me the most. That she knew. That she didn't hesitate. That maybe, all these years, she'd seen more than she let on. Because family doesn't always say it, but sometimes they know. They just wait for the moment to show it. The wildest part? I hadn't even watched the full interview myself before then. I'd seen clips, approved the edit, but I hadn't actually sat down and taken in the full 3 minutes. I didn't want to hear my own voice repeating things I hadn't said out loud in years. But when it played that night at the dinner table, something shifted inside me. It wasn't pride. It wasn't revenge. It was more like release. Like setting down a weight you'd carried so long you forgot it was there. I think we all carry those things, stories no one asks to hear, victories we bury because no one around us would know what to do with them. My family was full of people who measured success in hours worked, miles driven, injuries earned. They didn't understand the value of silence or the toll of thinking for a living. They understood bodies, not brains. Sweat, not strategy. And so I never bothered to try and explain it. But now they'd seen it. They'd heard it, not from me, but from the world. And once it's out there, you can't take it back. That's the thing about being invisible for so long. Once someone finally shines a light on you, it doesn't just blind them. It blinds you too. You stop knowing who you are without the dark. After the dinner, after the chaos that would come later, I went back and watched the interview again. This time alone. I saw a man talking who looked like me, sounded like me, but somehow seemed older, more certain, more worn out. And I realized maybe I hadn't changed as much as I thought. Maybe I'd just become better at hiding the bruises. But even bruises, when exposed to light, start to heal. And now they'd all seen mine on television, in prime time, over dessert. Which meant the Real story was only just beginning. The cake came out like it always did, too early, too sweet, and somehow more about tradition than celebration. It was a yellow sheet cake with a thick layer of frosting that tried too hard to be cheerful, piped with blue letters that read "Happy Birthday, Eli," like someone remembered just in time to call the bakery. Mom brought it in with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, probably hoping to smooth the air that had turned dense as concrete. Carla, who usually lit the candles, didn't move. She stayed seated, remote in hand, eyes still flicking between the screen and Roy like she was waiting for something bigger than sugar. The interview had just ended, and the room was colder than when we walked in. No one said a word for a full 30 seconds, not even Roy, which was rare enough to deserve its own kind of toast. The air was full of that invisible pressure families generate when one truth upsets the entire false balance they've lived inside for decades. And I was standing right at the center of that pressure, holding a fork and wondering if anyone would have the balls to look me in the eye again. Roy finally broke the silence, not with words, but with that low, grunting sound men make when they want you to know they're about to dismiss the whole thing. He leaned back in his chair like someone who'd been told the world was round for the first time and still didn't buy it. He reached for another piece of brisket that he didn't eat, chewed like it was cardboard, and stared straight ahead, past everyone and through me. Then came Nate, because of course it was Nate. He leaned in across the table and asked the question that wasn't really a question. "So, are you rich now?" He tried to laugh when he said it, like maybe if he sounded casual enough, no one would notice the sweat starting to break across his forehead. I looked at him and said nothing for a second longer than comfort aloud, then finally shrugged. "I'm doing okay," I said, which was both entirely true and a complete lie. Because how do you explain to someone like Nate that money doesn't fix what's broken inside you? That no matter how many zeros sit at the end of your bank statement, it doesn't rewrite the years spent feeling like you had to justify your existence? You can't. And I didn't try. Mom reached forward to cut the cake, fumbling with the knife like her hands had forgotten how to do simple things. She kept glancing at Roy, waiting for him to say something, to make a joke, to diffuse the tension the way he always did, even if it meant punching down. But Roy said nothing. His silence was louder than any insult he'd ever thrown my way, and it made the frosting taste bitter in my mouth. As the plates were passed around, Carla stood up quietly and walked to the kitchen, her absence somehow amplifying everything. She returned with a smaller plate, one I recognized from her collection of mismatched ceramic dishes that only came out for special guests. On it was a slice of the cheesecake I brought, not the store-bought kind, but the real one from that overpriced French bakery near my place. She set it down in front of me without saying a word and then sat back down. It was such a small act, that quiet moment of choosing my offering over the birthday cake they had prepared, but in that room, it was revolutionary. She wasn't just giving me dessert, she was choosing a side, drawing a line in frosting between the version of me they used to see and the version that just aired across the country in high definition. Roy saw it, too. His face twitched, just slightly, a crack in the stone wall he'd built around his pride. He looked at Carla, then at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something other than contempt in his eyes. It wasn't respect, not quite. It wasn't fear, either. It was closer to uncertainty, like he'd just realized he'd misread the map and now had no idea where the hell he was. "Nice interview," he finally muttered, not looking at me. "You talked good." It was the most backhanded compliment I'd ever received, but coming from him, it may as well have been a standing ovation. I nodded, accepted it, didn't push. There was no need. He'd already given up more power in that one quiet comment than he ever would have in a full apology. Stacy asked me something about the company, her voice brittle, her posture too straight, and I could tell she was scrambling to recalculate her internal social rankings. I answered her in the simplest terms possible, skipping all the technical jargon, not because I thought she'd understand it, but because I knew no one at that table actually cared. They didn't want to understand. They wanted to decide how to feel about me based on whether I was now important or just lucky. As we ate, the TV kept playing on low volume, something about markets, something about the economy, all noise. But in that moment, it sounded different. Like the house had been wired into a different world, and for once, my signal was coming in clearly. No static, no distortion. Just my voice telling the story they never asked to hear. And in that tiny window between awkward bites of cake and reluctant questions, something irreversible happened. They saw me. Not the kid who couldn't hit a curveball. Not the ex-husband with the failed marriage. Not the ghost in the family photos who never showed up for game night or barbecues or group texts. They saw the man who'd built something out of nothing and walked back into the room without asking for a damn thing. And Roy? He ate his cake in silence. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't loud. It's served cold, plated neatly, and eaten with a silver fork while your enemies watch and pretend it doesn't taste better than anything they've ever had. The strange part wasn't the silence that followed dessert, it was how quickly it turned from awkward to eerie, like someone had opened a window in the middle of a conversation and all the warmth had been sucked out into the cold October night. I'd expected the laughter to return eventually, maybe even some attempt at a joke from Nate or a passive-aggressive remark from Roy, something to remind us that this was still supposed to be a birthday dinner and not a wake. But nobody said much of anything. The only sounds were the clatter of plates being stacked and the soft shuffle of socks on old hardwood, as people busied themselves pretending to clean just so they didn't have to look me in the eye again. I'd spent my whole life being the quiet one, the one who let other people fill the air with their stories and opinions and unsolicited advice. But that night, the quiet was no longer mine, it belonged to all of them now, and none of them seemed to know what to do with it. For the first time, my silence wasn't interpreted as failure. It was power. And power makes people uncomfortable, especially when it changes hands right in front of them. Nate got up from the table without finishing his cake, muttering something about needing to make a work call. But I saw his phone on the sideboard, right where he left it, screen dark, untouched. A minute later, I heard the sound of the back screen door creak open, then slam shut harder than necessary. Classic Nate, when things don't go his way, he disappears, probably outside smoking one of those menthols he thinks no one knows about, pacing the backyard like he's waiting for an answer to fall out of the sky. Mom was fussing in the kitchen, moving things that didn't need moving, washing dishes that weren't even dirty yet, her shoulders tense and her lips tight in that way she always did when trying not to say the wrong thing. She kept glancing toward Roy like she wanted him to step in and fix the mood, to restore some sense of normalcy, but Roy was locked in his chair, arms crossed, still chewing his pride like it was the last bite of meat he was ever going to swallow. Carla sat back down after clearing just her own plate, not looking at Roy, not looking at anyone really, just sipping her coffee with the patience of a woman who had waited years for something to break and was now watching it finally, gloriously crack. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even blink much. She just sat in that thin little space between knowing and relief, like someone who had just set down a bag full of bricks she'd been carrying for 3 decades. I sat still, letting the weight of the moment settle in the room like dust on an unused bookshelf. I wasn't going to be the one to say anything. Not after that. I'd had my say, even if I never spoke a word. The interview had done what I could never do myself, cut through years of assumptions, and rewrote the script they'd all been reading from since I was a teenager. And the best part? I didn't even have to argue. I just had to wait. Eventually, Mom tried to offer a lifeline, asking me if I still lived in that little apartment downtown. I told her I moved out last month. I didn't add that the new place had views of the skyline and a lease that made me nervous in a way that only success can, like I was still waiting for someone to tell me I didn't belong there. She nodded slowly, like she didn't know what to say next, and I didn't help her. Roy finally stood up, pushing back his chair with that deliberate grunt of a man trying to remind the room that he was still the biggest presence in it. He didn't look at me as he left the table. Didn't say goodnight. Didn't even excuse himself. He just walked out of the room like a man retreating into a house he no longer recognized, footsteps heavy enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Carla waited until he was gone, then looked at me over her coffee mug and said, in a voice soft as steam, "He's never been good at not being the one people talk about." I didn't respond because I didn't need to. We both knew what she meant. Later, I found Nate in the backyard, standing near the rusted grill like he was guarding it. He had that wild look in his eyes people get when they're trying too hard not to cry. His beer was half frozen from sitting on the concrete too long, and he didn't say anything when I stepped outside. "You could have told me," he finally said after a long pause, not looking at me. His voice cracked just enough for me to hear something underneath it. Hurt, confusion, maybe even betrayal. Would it have made a difference? I asked. He didn't answer. Just stared out into the darkness like he was waiting for it to answer for him. The truth is, Nate wasn't mad about the money. He was mad because he'd spent his whole life measuring success by what Roy told him it looked like: muscle, hours, sweat, noise, and I'd just proved there was another way. A quieter way. A smarter way. And it made him question everything he'd built his identity on. That's the kind of thing that doesn't settle easy. We stood there for a long time, both of us in silence now, not as a weapon, but as a kind of truce. The cold wrapped around us like an old coat, familiar and heavy, and I suddenly realized how many winters I'd spent trying to get warm in this family, trying to prove I wasn't just another fluke or flake. And now that I was warm, truly warm, none of them knew what to do with me. That night didn't end with hugs or laughter or toasts, or even the usual awkward family photos. It ended with dishes in the sink and conversations left dangling in the middle like ropes cut clean in two. Everyone left earlier than usual. Nobody said goodbye the same way they usually did. And I didn't mind. Because sometimes silence isn't awkward. Sometimes silence is the sound of truth finally being heard. It was some time after the kitchen lights had been turned off and the leftover brisket shoved into foil that I found myself drifting down the old wooden steps into the basement, not to hide exactly, but to breathe somewhere without so many eyes on me. That basement hadn't changed in 30 years. It still smelled faintly of sawdust, mildew, and old paint, The kind of place where things were stored and forgotten, like exercise bikes from the 90s and dusty boxes labeled Christmas in fading marker. I used to come down here as a kid to escape the noise upstairs, the shouting, the bragging, the heavy silences between adults that kids aren't supposed to notice, but always do. It had been my fortress of solitude, and now, oddly enough, I found myself back here like no time had passed at all. I was sitting on the edge of an old recliner with a broken lever when I heard the steps creak, slowly, deliberately, the way people walk when they're not sure if they're welcome in a space. It was Carla, carrying 2 mugs of black coffee and wearing that same expression she always wore when she was about to tell you something important, calm but careful, like she was unwrapping a fragile truth that might shatter if touched too hard. She handed me 1 mug and sat down on the sagging couch across from me, her legs crossed neatly, her hands steady even though I could tell her heart wasn't. "I figured you'd end up down here," she said, not unkindly, just observantly, the way someone speaks when they've known you longer than you've known yourself. I took a sip of the coffee and waited. She didn't rush into it. Carla never did. She let the silence stretch out, not awkwardly, but with purpose, like she was giving the room time to settle, to catch up with the things that had just happened upstairs. I could still hear the faint hum of the television through the vents, some late-night news segment talking about interest rates or overseas markets, but it felt miles away from where we were sitting. "You know, Roy used to be different," she said finally, staring at a spot on the wall behind me like it might hold the past in its cracks. "Before the job, before the back problems, before everything turned into a competition." I wasn't sure how to respond, so I didn't. I just let her speak, because you don't interrupt a story that someone's finally ready to tell. "He wasn't always loud, you know. He wasn't always so cruel. I married him because he was the first man who ever looked at me like I wasn't temporary, like I was something solid. But somewhere along the way, that look turned into something else. Something harder. And he started seeing the world in winners and losers. Men who earned their place and men who didn't." She paused and glanced at me, and for the first time that night, I saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, not just sadness, but regret. Deep, aching regret that came from decades of silence, of biting your tongue so hard it leaves scars. "And I think, no, I know he's always been scared of you," she said, her voice firmer now. "Because you did something he never could. You changed. You left. You grew in ways he never let himself believe were possible." I let that sink in, because hearing it from her meant more than hearing it from anyone else in that house. Carla had always been the quiet observer, the one who saw things but never said them out loud. And now she was saying them to me, here in the cold basement that smelled like ghosts and forgotten summers. "He used to talk about you like you were soft," she continued, her words careful, measured. "Like you were weak. But the truth is, you're the strongest one in this damn family, Eli. You never stopped pushing forward, even when none of us understood what you were doing." I felt my throat tighten, not from emotion exactly, but from the sheer weight of being seen. Truly seen. Not for the version of myself they built in their heads, but for who I actually was. It's a strange kind of vulnerability, being recognized after so many years of invisibility. "I saw the interview before tonight," she admitted. "I didn't tell Roy. I wasn't going to. But then I watched him make that comment about Breadwinners, and I thought, no, not this time. Not again." She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees now, voice low and fierce. "You've let them write your story for too long, Eli. It's about damn time they read the one you actually wrote." I didn't have an answer to that. There wasn't anything to say that would make the moment more real than it already was. We just sat there, the two of us, in the same silence that had suffocated so many truths over the years, now slowly transforming into something softer, more forgiving. Before she stood to leave, she said one last thing, quietly, almost like she wasn't sure she should. "You're not the only one who lost years to this family's bullshit ideas about worth." And then she was gone, footsteps retreating up the stairs, leaving me alone with the hum of the old furnace and a coffee cup that had gone cold. I stayed in the basement for a while after that, thinking about what she said, thinking about Roy and Nate, and all the years I spent convincing myself their approval was the only currency that mattered. And somewhere in that silence, a new thought crept in, uninvited but undeniable. What if I was never supposed to win their game? What if I was meant to burn the board and build a new one? Because after tonight, it felt like the pieces were finally mine to move. The air outside had turned colder since dinner ended, the kind of creeping chill that works its way through your clothes and makes the skin on your neck tighten without warning. I stepped onto the driveway with no plan, no coat, and no reason other than needing air that hadn't been filtered through 30 years of family tension and unresolved resentment. The stars were out, but barely visible through the haze of the porch lights and the distant glow of the street lamps. I heard the door close behind me, quiet and slow, and I already knew it was Roy before I turned around. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood a few feet behind me, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets, breathing a little too loudly like he had just come from wrestling with himself in the dark. There was a stiffness in his posture, the kind that comes from a man who's lived long enough to feel the weight of his own words come back around. The silence between us felt heavier than it did at the dinner table, not because it was angry, but because it was honest. There was nothing left to hide behind now. No roast to carve, no jokes to deflect with, no beers to raise in performative masculinity. Just us, two men from the same family tree, standing under a half-dead sky with decades of misunderstanding between us. "You think you're better than me now," he said finally, voice low and not quite steady, like he didn't even believe the question he was asking. I turned slowly to face him, hands in my pockets, and shrugged, because what the hell do you say to that? I didn't want to be better. I never did. I just wanted to be seen as something other than the family fluke who never played football and couldn't hang drywall. "I don't think I'm better," I said after a pause that stretched too long. "I think I finally stopped trying to impress people who never tried to understand me." That hit him harder than I expected, or maybe exactly as hard as he'd feared it would. He looked away, down the driveway, at the neighbor's porch light flickering in the distance like it might offer him some escape from what was happening. But there was nowhere to go. He'd cornered himself the moment he mocked me in front of everyone. The moment he said those words about dessert like he was passing final judgment on my manhood. "You never gave a damn about what I built," I added, feeling the cold bite into my jaw now. "You never asked. You just assumed I was wasting my time because it didn't look like what you did." Roy shifted his weight, his boots grinding against the cracked concrete, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Not from the cold, but from something deeper. Regret, maybe. Shame. Or worse, recognition. "I worked my ass off for 40 years, he muttered, not looking at me. Put food on the table, busted my back, built things that you could actually touch. That meant something. Still does." "I'm not saying it doesn't," I replied, more gently than I expected. "But you built those things while tearing down everyone who did something different. You made sure none of us ever forgot that our way wasn't the right way. Just yours." He flinched a little, like the words hit something soft he'd tried to cover with steel for too long. And then he laughed, not the usual booming Roy laugh, but a dry, bitter exhale that came with the weight of something unspoken, finally cracking the surface. "I always thought you were weak," he said, eyes still fixed on the distance. "Too soft. Too quiet. Figured you'd crash and burn by 30, end up crawling back home, asking for a loan." "I thought the same about you," I said, and for a second we both blinked, surprised by my honesty. "Except I thought you were too angry to ever listen. Too proud to change. And too damn scared to admit you were wrong about anything." That silenced him, truly silenced him, in a way I hadn't seen since I was a kid watching him yell at a broken lawnmower like it had betrayed him personally. He was breathing heavy now, like he'd run up a flight of stairs, and when he finally looked at me, there was something raw behind his eyes, something almost vulnerable. "I wasn't scared of your success," he said, slowly. I was scared of what it meant about mine. And just like that, the storm passed between us in a single sentence. I didn't answer right away because I was still trying to wrap my head around what I'd just heard. Roy, the man who once called me a daydreaming sissy for wanting to study computer science, had just confessed something real. Not wrapped in a joke or a sneer, but plain and heavy and real. I spent my whole life trying to be the man my old man wasn't, he continued, finally meeting my eyes. Thought if I worked hard, kept my head down, and never cried, I'd never be like him. But I was. Hell, maybe worse. I turned into someone who thought making people feel small was the same as being strong. And what do you even say to that? For a long time, I said nothing. Because forgiveness, like truth, doesn't always arrive on command. Sometimes it just waits around the corner of a sentence that hurts too much to finish. I didn't hug him. I didn't offer some cinematic moment of closure. I just stood there with him, on the cracked driveway where I used to shoot hoops as a kid, letting him be something other than the man I'd resented for decades. I'm not asking you to like me, I said after a long silence. But I'm done pretending I need you to. He nodded once, slow and tired, like a man who had finally stopped trying to hold up a collapsing roof. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, steps slower than before, hands still deep in his pockets, head a little lower than when he came out. I didn't follow him. I stood out there a little while longer, staring up at the sky that still offered no stars, and thought about what Carla had said in the basement, about silence, about strength, about being seen. Roy hadn't apologized, not really. But maybe that was the closest he could get. And maybe, just maybe, that would have to be enough. By the time I got into my car, the windows had fogged from the temperature drop, and the engine took a few stubborn seconds to turn over, like even it was reluctant to leave that house behind. I sat there for a while in the glow of the dashboard lights, not starting the drive, not playing music, just watching my own breath mist up in the cold and swirl against the windshield like smoke from a fire that had finally burned itself out. Everything inside me felt strangely still, not victorious, not broken, just worn down like something long overdue for rest. The kind of stillness you get only after surviving a storm you didn't realize you'd been standing in for years. There was no big family send-off, no one waving from the porch, no warm words or plastic-wrapped leftovers shoved into my hands like a consolation prize. Nate hadn't come back inside before I left. Mom gave me a quick hug without saying anything about the interview or the dinner or what it meant that Roy had left the room instead of dominating it like he always did. Carla caught my eye once, gave me a nod, and that was all it took to say everything that needed saying. She'd already said enough, and so had I. The road out of the neighborhood looked the same as it always did, familiar street signs, darkened driveways, the same cracked sidewalks we used to race bikes on before life taught us that not everyone gets to keep pedaling. I passed the park where I'd once broken my arm falling off the monkey bars, past the gas station where Roy used to buy beer on Sundays and swear under his breath about the prices, past the school I left behind as soon as I could, carrying all their low expectations in my backpack like dead weight. Everything looked the same, but I didn't feel the same, and I couldn't tell if that was peace or just distance. In some twisted way, I had spent most of my adult life trying to earn the right to be quiet. Not just in a room full of louder people, but in a life full of demands and debts and voices always telling you what you should have done differently. Success, for me, didn't come with yachts or champagne or a beachfront house. It came in moments like this, sitting alone in my car, knowing I didn't owe anyone an explanation anymore. That I could drive away from that house without guilt sitting in the passenger seat, whispering old doubts into my ear. The money, the company, the TV interview, those were all just surface wins, things other people could measure and misunderstand. What they couldn't see was the real thing I earned, the ability to be myself without apology, to not flinch when someone tried to define me, to stand in a room full of people who once pitted me and not need to explain a damn thing. But even as I thought that, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still carried all those years when I did try. The kid who wanted Roy to nod with approval just once. The young man who thought making six figures would shut everyone up. The guy who swallowed his own stories so no one could call them exaggerations. That part of me was still in there somewhere, quieter now, maybe scarred over, but not dead. And maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe we don't actually bury the past. Maybe we just learn to carry it without letting it drag us backwards. There's a moment you get to in every family story where the battle isn't about who's right anymore. It's about who's willing to let go. I didn't walk out of that house with a win in the traditional sense. There was no applause, no moment of public reckoning where Roy stood up and admitted everything he'd done wrong. But I left on my own terms, and that felt like something sacred. Like a door closing behind me, not with a slam, but with a final, resolute click. When I got home, the loft was dark and quiet, just the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of traffic down on the avenue. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I sat on the couch in the dark, letting my eyes adjust to the quiet, thinking about the path that had brought me here, the wrong turns, the humiliations, the wins no one celebrated because they didn't look like what this family recognized as success. The interview had aired in front of millions of strangers, and yet somehow it mattered more that Roy had heard it. Isn't that stupid? That after all the work, all the years, I still cared whether the man who mocked my college major could sit through 3 minutes of my voice without laughing. And maybe he did laugh, after I left. Maybe he tore it apart in his head and rebuilt it into something that still made him the hero. I wouldn't know. That's his story to rot in. Not mine. Carla had told me something in the basement that stuck with me like a splinter under the skin, quiet but impossible to ignore. She said I wasn't the only one who'd lost years to the lies men told themselves to feel strong. And she was right. I think everyone in that house had lost something. Time, joy, dignity, the ability to speak truthfully without fear. And maybe no one ever wins in a family like that. Maybe all you can do is survive long enough to tell your own version of what happened and hope it sticks. I looked out the window of my apartment that night, past the buildings and streetlights, past the skyline that now looked more like something I'd earned than something I envied. And I realized I didn't need them to understand me anymore. I didn't need Roy to admit he was wrong, or Nate to stop competing, or Mom to stop apologizing for keeping the peace. I didn't need Carla to carry the weight of being the only one who saw me. Because the truth is, I see myself now. And after all these years, that might be the most valuable thing I've ever owned. The funny part? I thought getting on national TV would feel like a finish line, some grand moment where everything clicks into place and you're finally free. But life doesn't work like that. Nothing wraps up neatly. Nothing closes the loop completely. Even as I closed my eyes that night, I could still hear Roy's voice in my head, still feel the sting of his words, still wonder if he sat up thinking about me or buried it under more beer and silence. But I didn't need the answer anymore. And that silence? That silence was mine.